Corvin, 5th Division, Field Command. The morning briefing came as a folded report, the specific fold of the 5th Division's intelligence distribution. 3 panels, the third panel sealed with a numbered tab. Corvin noted the tab number in his operational log and then opened the seal. The index assessment for the Orval sector ran to 4 pages. He read the summary table first, as he always did. Laplacian Index, Operational Probability Assessment. Operation, Approach, Orval Sector, Preliminary. Assessment date, 14th day, 3rd campaign month. Confidence interval, plus minus 4.8%. Civilian displacement 14-day projection, 6,400 to 9,100. Infrastructure damage score, 5.9/10. Operational timeline, 8 to 12 days. LaCourse force casualty range, 3.4% to 6.1% of deployed strength. Opposing force casualty range, 14.2% to 19.7% of estimated presence. Lorenz horizon, 19 days post-initiation. He set the summary table aside and read the topographical overlay. The Orval district occupied a river junction that the index classified as high-leverage infrastructure. Both the bridge at Orval and the storage facilities on the eastern bank had appeared in previous assessments, always within the top 4 items on the strategic priority list, always deferred. They had been deferred for 2 campaign seasons. The Army Group Command had decided, on the basis of the index's cumulative forecasting, that the cost of securing Orval was acceptable at the current stage of operations. Corvin did not disagree with this assessment. He noted it, considered it, and moved on to the logistics annex, which was where the actual work was. The 5th Division had 12 companies in functional condition, 3 under strength. Movement to the staging area east of the Keld Ridge would require 4 days of coordinated transport, complicated by the fact that the supply corridor through the Ashfield zone had been unreliable since the border administration increased checkpoint processing times. He made a note. Supply corridor transit, flag for logistics command, 3-day minimum lead. Then he moved on to the next item. Outside his command post, a requisitioned farmhouse with good sightlines and a roof that mostly held, he could hear the camp organizing itself for morning. The 5th Division had been in this position for 11 days, which was 2 days past the optimal window for maintaining operational readiness without visible deterioration of morale. He had noted this in his weekly assessment to Army Group Command. The assessment had been acknowledged. His adjutant, Lieutenant Asel, came in at 8 with the updated personnel report and a cup of something hot that wasn't quite coffee. Asel was 26 and had been his adjutant for 9 months, long enough to have learned to put the personnel report on the left side of the table and the coffee on the right, and to wait to be spoken to before speaking. "Anything urgent?" Corvin said. "3rd Company has 3 more with the respiratory infection. Medical recommends non-deployment status for all 3. That brings us to 11 in the division." "Note it. Has Captain Neven confirmed the adjusted strength report?" "This morning, sir. Adjusted for the respiratory cases, we're at 91.3% effective deployment strength, within acceptable parameters." Corvin wrote respiratory cases, 11, 3rd COI add in his log. Then, F deploystra, 91.3%. Acceptable. He was a person who wrote things down. He had been a person who wrote things down since basic training, when an instructor had told him that the Army creates the record it needs, not the record that happened, and that a soldier who maintained his own record was a soldier who could be accountable to himself regardless of what the official documentation said. He had taken this seriously. He had 18 years of operational logs. He was not sure, looking back through them now and then, that the instructor had meant it the way Corvin had taken it. The Orvale Index assessment came in. He said, "Have the company commanders read and sign the summary, all 12. Including Neven? Especially Neven." Captain Neven was competent and aggressive in a ratio that occasionally created unnecessary variance. He needed to understand the numbers before he made decisions in the field, not during. "Have the read and sign completed by midday meal. I want them to have the afternoon to think before the evening briefing." "Understood, sir." Asel paused. "The displacement estimate? What about it?" 9,000, approximately. Corvin looked at his coffee. 6,400 to 9,100. That's the range. "Yes, sir. The operation proceeds regardless of which end of the range actualizes." A pause that Asel had enough experience to keep brief. Understood, sir. After Aesel left, Corvin read the full 4-page report. He was thorough about this. Some officers took the summary table as the complete picture and moved on. Corvin had learned, over 18 years, that the most important information in an index assessment was usually in the footnotes to the 3rd page. The qualifications, the model limitations, the places where the index's own confidence degraded. The plus-minus 4.8% interval on the headline figures masked a wider variance on the infrastructure projection. The damage score of 5.910 had a secondary note indicating it did not account for potential secondary fires. He wrote, "Secondary fire risk unmodeled. Check with engineers or Vale storage facility construction." Then he read the Lorenz Horizon entry, 19 days post-initiation, and wrote that too, separately in a different part of the log from the operational notes. He had started keeping a separate section for Lorenz Horizon entries 3 campaigns ago. He couldn't have explained why, exactly, except that the Lorenz Horizon was the number he found most honest. Everything the index projected was true only up to that horizon. After 19 days, the initial conditions would have diverged enough that the original model was no longer predicting anything real. The operation would have, by then, become whatever it became. He found this clarifying rather than troubling. The index was a tool. It had a range within which it was reliable, and a range beyond which it was extrapolating. The Army Group's habit of treating the index as a form of certainty, as if the plus-minus 4.8% interval were 0, as if the Lorenz Horizon didn't exist, was an institutional choice that he did not make in his own operational planning, but that he also did not argue with directly, because the argument was not his to make, and the decisions above his level were not his to override. He noted what was true. He did his job within what was true. At 11, the company commanders began coming through in pairs to read and sign the index summary. Corvin sat at his table and let them read and asked each of them, "What are your questions about the displacement estimate?" He had asked this question after index briefings for 4 years, and the answers still varied. Some officers had no questions. Some had questions about logistics. What happens to displaced civilians? Who is responsible for the transit corridors? Captain Nevin had questions about the opposing force casualty range, specifically the upper bound. 19.7%, Nevin said. That's assuming full engagement density. Assuming a concentration we haven't confirmed. We should confirm before we move. We will. Corvin looked at him. That's what the next 8 days are for, Nevin. Nevin was satisfied by this, which was good, because Corvin was not satisfied by it himself, but couldn't say so without creating a different kind of problem. The confirmation would be approximate. The index's opposing force estimate had a secondary confidence interval that was wider than the headline figure suggested, and the Army Group's intelligence on actual force disposition in the Orvale sector was 7 days old, which was a significant gap at this stage of operations. He had noted this in his assessment to Army Group Command. The assessment had been acknowledged. The afternoon was logistics, movement orders, supply requisitions, the particular detailed work of moving 12 companies and their equipment over 4 days through a corridor that had been unreliable. He was good at this. He had been good at logistics since his 3rd year of service, which was when he'd understood that the difference between an operation that worked and one that didn't was usually not the plan, but the supply chain. Ideas were cheap. Fuel, ammunition, and dry rations were not. At 1600, the Army Group Command relay came through with the confirmed movement order. He read it twice. It was unambiguous. He wrote it in his log. Orvale approach confirmed. Movement begins 6 day, 0530. Index briefing final assessment attached. He set down the pen. Through the farmhouse window, the ridge to the west was going amber in the late afternoon light. The supply corridor through the Ashfield zone was visible as a thread of track below the ridge. He'd learned, over 11 days of looking at this view, to read the activity on that track. At this hour, there was the usual movement of supply transport, plus a cluster of slower traffic that was probably civilians using the authorized transit window, 6,400 to 9,100. The lower end was better, and the upper end was worse, and either end was a function of variables the index could model but not guarantee. He had noted the secondary fire risk. He had sent the observation to the engineers. He picked up the pen and wrote the 6th day's date in the operational log, below the movement order confirmation. He drew a single line under it. Then he wrote, "The operation begins," and below that, because he was a person who wrote things down, who had been a person who wrote things down for 18 years. The numbers are what they are. The numbers are what they are was what he wrote at the end of difficult assessments. When the index's figures produced a range that required him to carry something. When the operational arithmetic landed in a place that the framing of an efficient commander did not quite cover. He'd been writing it for 6 years. It was the sentence that meant, I have looked at this directly, I have not looked away, I am continuing. He looked at the page and counted. He had written that sentence or its equivalent. The numbers are accurate, the range is what it is, the model is correct. 31 times. He had counted because he was a person who counted things precisely. 31 times in 6 years of keeping operational logs. The Orval range was 280 to 440. He had been in operations where the range was higher. He had been in operations where the secondary estimate, the 30-day indirect mortality, had been larger than the Orval figure. He had written the sentence 31 times, and each time it had meant the same thing, acknowledged, carried, proceeding. He thought 32 will be after tomorrow. He thought, and the question is not whether I can write it again. The question is whether I should have learned something by now that writing it would help me learn. He did not know what that something was. He had been writing the sentence for 6 years, and he had not yet learned it. Through the farmhouse window, the last of the amber light was leaving the ridge. The supply corridor track was going dark. In 4 hours, the camp would stir at pre-operation hours, the specific pre-operation quiet that he'd learned to distinguish from other kinds of quiet, the contained energy of 12 companies preparing to move. He had read that quality in dozens of nights over 18 years. It had never felt entirely routine, despite the routine. There was always underneath the routine the specific knowledge that the people who were currently sitting at fires or sleeping or running pre-operation checklists would be different people by this time tomorrow, carrying different facts, different absences, different knowledge of what they could do and what they had done. The operation changed people. He had been changed by 31 operations, in ways that the log recorded and in ways that it didn't, and tomorrow he would be changed again. He didn't think about this usually. He thought about it now, because the farmhouse window showed the ridge going dark, and there was nothing left to plan. He had been changed in ways he could document, the specific sounds that triggered alertness, the particular quality of early morning that would always contain operational content, the ability to eat a full meal during any level of operational stress, because you couldn't function on empty, and the body required maintenance. He had been changed in ways the log could not hold. The relationship to numbers that he had developed over 31 operations, which was not the same as the relationship to numbers he'd had as a young officer. Not the same precision, but a different kind. The precision of a person who had looked at enough ranges and confirmed enough results to know what was inside the numbers and what was not, and what you could use the numbers to say and what the numbers could not say, regardless of how precisely you calculated them. He was carrying 31 of those accumulated changes into the 32nd. He closed the log. In the morning, the camp would begin to move.